Hello and welcome to this Photoshop and Adobe Camera Raw video. My name's Barry Beckham. Now if you're anything like me, you may develop various techniques that help you to achieve your image editing quickly and efficiently. I want to produce the best processed image I can, but it's important to limit the time we spend doing this as long as it doesn't impact on the image, of course. I think most photographers who are viewing this video would see exactly where I'm coming from. The image that I currently have open in Adobe Camera Raw is not going to set the world on fire. I appreciate that. But it is pretty typical of the type of image we may capture if perhaps we made a visit to the zoo, especially when the sun is shining. Most animals retreat to the shade, which can give us exposure problems, but these guys just love the sun. So now we're battling contrast. That tends to mean that whatever manipulation I apply to the animal itself is probably not going to be wholly appropriate for the background and vice versa. Now in one of my most recent videos I demonstrated auto masking in Adobe Camera Raw. And that works in instances like this, and I'll link to that video below. It is worth a look because the technique is fairly easy and it works well too. So here I'd like to take a slightly different route and make use of the Select Subject option in Photoshop. I want to deal with the contrast on the lizard. I want to add some colour and some impact. I also want to subdue the background and especially that out of focus green colour, because as I add colour to the animal, then that green's going to get quite vivid. Just before we start, I want to make sure I have my Smart Object status turned on. So a quick look to the centre bottom of the screen, there's a hyperlink. Click the hyperlink and the Camera Raw preferences will open. We need the workflow option on the top left, and then the option we want from that panel is this one here. Tick the box to open in Photoshop as a smart object. Once we tick the box, it will remain ticked until we come into this panel and remove it. Now I'd like to start on the background, ignoring the main subject just for a moment. So I'm going to go to my Basic tab. The green out of focus areas in the background are a little bit too strong for me, so I'm going to drop the vibrance on those. Let's drop the highlights down a little bit. That'll take a bit down and maybe even a little bit of exposure. I've got a bright spot over on the left hand side. Number of ways we can deal with that, but I could select my gradient filter and I could click and drag from the top left all the way down maybe and just drop the exposure up there a little more. I could certainly do that at the bottom upwards to kill a lot of the problems in the foreground. Whatever that is, it looks like some sort of root system. Maybe I could drop that down even a little more. And I've got a bit of lightness here which maybe I'll deal with via an adjustment brush. So I'll just brush over that area. Take down the exposure, maybe the little bit of highlights as well, although I think it's mainly exposure, and I'm just going to paint that down to take down the density of that. You can see I'm just using a flow here of about 8, it's quite low. While I've got that brush selected and it seems to be doing a good job here, there's a little bit there and a little bit there, and we can darken that a little more too. You can see the sort of things we can do. Top right, look, maybe even that a little more, maybe that one. That's the sort of thing. I think I'm ready to open this up into Photoshop. Then we can come back and take a look just at the lizard. Now once we have the image open in Photoshop, we can see from the layer thumbnail here, the bottom right corner, we've got a little symbol that's telling us we're working with a smart object. I'm sure you know what a smart object is, but for those that maybe don't, it gives us instant access back into Camera Raw. I can double click this thumbnail, I can be back into Camera Raw, I can make change on top of change on top of change, and when I click OK, the image opened up in Photoshop is updated, but I'm not doing any damage to the image quality by adding multiple changes one on top of the other, because we're working on a raw file all the time. What I want though is to have two separate layers. One I can manipulate from the background, which we've just done. The other one I can manipulate just for the lizard. To be able to achieve that, I need to move my cursor to the right of the thumbnail, right click and choose New Smart Object via Copy. Now with that layer copy created, I can double click, open this up into Camera Raw, and any changes I make now will only affect the one layer. What I'd like to do is to reset some of the changes I applied to the background. I don't need the exposure dropped at the moment, so I'm going to reset that by double clicking, same with the highlights and the same with the vibrance. The problem we have here is one of contrast. So I'm going to take the highlights well down, the shadows well up. Now that usually makes the image look a little on the flat side. So I normally go to the clarity and increase that, which is mid-tone contrast. I may actually touch the whites just to put a bit of sparkle into the animal, but without going too far. But we certainly need quite a lot of vibrance, and that puts a nice bit of colour into the animal. I think there's a couple of things I'd like to do. I'd like to lighten the area just around here, and I'm going to do that with an adjustment brush. So let's select that from the toolbox. I want to just increase the exposure a little bit there. If you look over on the right hand side, you can see the flow rate is set quite low at 8%. I'll drop the size of my brush down with those square bracket keys to the right of the letter P, because I just want to lift the tones in that strategic area a little bit, just to put a little bit more emphasis on the animal's face. Maybe I'll concentrate a little more on the eye just to brighten that up. Let's try tweaking a little more. Just make a mental note that I've got 0.65 just in case I go too far. Sometimes if you try dragging the sliders, it can be a bit imprecise. You can put your cursor in these boxes and you can use the up and down arrow keys on the keyboard. And now you can see I can scroll up and down any way I feel. I'm not releasing the key, that's why we've got a bit of a lag there, but you can see very easy for me to get back to the 0.65 or investigate going a little bit brighter if I feel it needs it. Now I'm also looking at the back of the animal, and I think maybe I could do with putting a little bit of more tone into the tail and the main body, so we sort of push the emphasis back up to the head of the animal, the important part. So I'm going to go to my adjustment brush and the little plus sign, and that's telling the software that I want to use a second brush, or in my case a third brush, because I've used one on the background. I'm going to make my brush bigger. I think I'll go back to the right hand side and drop the exposure down, and I'm just going to brush over the main body. You can see what I'm doing here, just pushing the emphasis up towards the head more. And that's all I really needed to do. Look at the greens in the background now, because I've enhanced the animal itself. You can see how those greens would be quite obtrusive now, but in the background that we've got waiting for us in Photoshop, they are nicely subdued. I'm just going to touch the Z key here to bring us back to the main sliders, because there's a couple of things I'd like to look at. First thing I'm going to do is zoom in on the animal's head and the eye to about 100%. So once I've got the animal at 100%, we're just a little bit above that, I'm going to look at detail, sharpness, and also texture. Let's do the detail sharpness first in the detail tab here. what I'm going to do is to go to the little option just to the right of the sharpening and click, because I want to get to the masking slider. If I hold my Alt key and move this slider to the right, anything that's black or dark will not be sharpened, anything that's white will. So if I mask to somewhere around there and then release my key, I should be able to add sharpening just to the animal's head and not to the background. It's not that important in our case because we've got a different background waiting for this image, but it's an important technique which you may want to use. I'm going to step the sharpening up quite a bit, so look at the animal around the eye as I do that, and you can see that marginal change. It's not massive, but it's worth taking. So I'm going to go up to around about 125. Then I'd like to go into my basic tab, and I'm going to take a look at this tool. This is designed for subjects with texture. Well, we've got bags of that here. So let me step that up halfway. You can see there's quite a difference there. All of these changes are marginal, but they do add up. And what we're doing here is gradually separating the animal from the background. I'm going to select that texture. And I think at the moment I'm going to hit Ctrl-0, just going to take one last look, but then I'm going to go down to the bottom, click OK to open this up into Photoshop. So with the image opened up into Photoshop, I've got the best of both worlds now. If I turn the top layer off, I've got the subdued background sitting on the layer below, but I've got the main subject on the layer above. Just to make this a little bit easier, I think what I'll do is I'll just switch these around, click drag and drop to drop the main subject to the bottom of the stack, and on the top layer I'm going to go down to the bottom of the layers and add a mask. But immediately I'm going to reselect the image because I need to go to my select menu at the top left of the Photoshop screen. I'm going to choose Select Subject. Photoshop generally does a pretty good job of this, but we may need to make some adjustments. If you look across to the left hand side, you'll notice that I've got my lasso tool selected, and I'm going to select one of the options from the bar at the top so I can remove from a selection. You'll notice there's a little minus alongside the cursor, because if I come down here I don't want that section there selected, so I'm going to ring that to remove it. But I probably do need the fingers and the hand of the animal, so I'm not going to do this very carefully. I'm going to go back up here and select now to add one selection to another, so you get a little plus sign. So I'm not going to be too careful here, but something like that. So there I have a selection of my subject. I'm going to go up to Select and Mask from the top of the screen. And I'm going to select from the view options. I usually work with black and white unless I've got a good reason to change that. The feather, I've got a 30 megapixel image here, so 2 or 3 pixels will probably do it. And I'm going to output to a selection, so I'm going to click OK to that. Now I can select my mask. I can go to the left and select a soft edge brush from the toolbox. And I need to make sure I've got black as my foreground colour. And I can use the square bracket keys to the right of the letter P to make my brush fairly large. If I can draw your attention to the opacity setting, which is 100%, but the flow, obviously been left from a previous piece of work, is very low at 1%. So I think I'll select something like about 30%. I'm going to touch the number 3 key to adjust that. But before I actually start doing any masking, I think what I'll also do is hide my selection. Control H will do that. So now I can start to reveal my lizard from beneath. Now you can see this is fairly easy to do. No great problem at all. The only area we're going to have to look a little bit more carefully at is the fingers of the animal's right hand. Now I can do that by zooming in a bit and reducing the brush size. And rather than spraying black now, I can switch to white. If you look over on the left hand side to the bottom of the toolbox, you can see black and white is the foreground and background colour. We can switch those using the X key, so it does save rather a long journey over there. Then I can take any colour away from between the fingers and just make good the little bit of work we've been doing here. As you can see, it's not something that we need to be overly precise with, and if you're not sure you've got the fingers absolutely perfect, then you can touch the X key and you can go over those. But I think we've got them just about right. Control 0 will fit the image on screen. I think we need just a couple of minutes time out just to think about the image and look at what we may want to do next, if anything. Now maybe I could choose to put a small highlight in the animal's eye, just to put a bit of sparkle in there. To do that, I'm going to go down to the bottom of the layers and to create a new blank layer to create that little spot on. I need to zoom in on the eye, and I need to make a selection of that little shape there, I think. So I've got my freehand lasso selected from the toolbox, so I'm just going to recreate that shape. I'll soften the edge of that, but because it's so small it's not going to need much. Select and mask should do that. So you can see that's quite soft. Let's take this to 0.5. That looks okay. Click OK. All I'm going to do here is to pick up white as my foreground colour. I'm going to pick up my brush. I'll drop the flow of the brush down to about 5%. And I'll just wipe over that. But what I'll do is I'll hide the selection, Control H. I'll hit Control 0 to fit this on screen, just to make sure it looks okay. And it's looking good, isn't it? So if I come in, I think I can actually continue that until it becomes pure white. Now I've just saved my image as a Photoshop document because I can come back another day and all of the layers you can see on the right hand side will be recreated for me, and I could make some changes if I felt there was a need. But at the moment I think I'm quite happy now to go to the top right of the layers and choose to flatten this to finish. But there's just one other thing I'd like to do. I'd like to do something with that little bit of blue just to the left of that highlight. So if we go to the toolbox, I'm going to pick up my spot healing brush. Just give this a little bit of a touch with the brush, and there we have it. I'll hit Control 0 to fit the image back on screen. Now with the spinning round of the screen, I've gone ahead and done the last little bit of manipulations off camera because I want to be able to turn them on and off to draw your attention to how effective it is to deal with small highlights. We have some down at the center base of the image in that root system. They're not significant, but when we see them all dealt with in a simple way with the spot healing brush, and because I've got them on a new layer here, if I turn the layer on, just look at the bottom half of the image as I turn it on and off. Look at the difference that it makes. It is quite considerable, and of course the highlights in some images can be worse than this. Of course, once we're happy with what we've done, we can finally flatten to finish the image. Now, as you can see here, we're looking at the original file, the one before any manipulation took place. It's quite clear as we look at this that many of us photographers find ourselves in situations which, from a lighting point of view, are less than perfect. Well, it's nice to be able to use our Photoshop or our Lightroom techniques to actually bring something of worth from something that may not have been at first glance a worthwhile image. So while this image isn't one of those that's going to stop the world and win competitions, it's bread and butter to many amateur photographers, and we can make quite a difference. If you're watching on YouTube, please consider subscribing to my channel and hit that notification bell, because without that you won't be informed whenever I post a new video. And if you think the video is worth it, give me a thumbs up too. I'll see you next time.